That's not clickbait. A trail camera deep in the Alberta backcountry captured something no one was prepared for: an enormous figure, easily 15 feet tall, crouched over the body of a full-grown moose. The camera only caught a few blurry frames, but what it showed wasn't a bear, and it wasn't anything science can explain. The footage was just the beginning. When the wildlife technician went back to check the site, the moose wasn't eaten like prey. It was twisted, its bones snapped in ways no natural predator could do. From that moment on, the forest stopped feeling like forest. The birds went silent, tree knocks echoed back at every step, and something massive started circling his camp in the dead of night. The authorities brushed it off as bear activity, but the missing cameras, the footprints pressed into clay, and the feeling of being stalked told another story. If the trail cam proved a 15-foot Sasquatch exists, then what exactly was it doing out there, and why did it seem to target him? Next, let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. If you like stories that connect us, don't forget to subscribe before you leave. Been a wildlife technician for nearly 7 years now, specializing in large mammal population studies across Western Canada. My current contract has me tracking moose populations in northern Alberta, about 200 kilometers northwest of Fort McMurray. It's the kind of work that requires patience, attention to detail, and most importantly, a comfort with extended periods of isolation. The territory I'm surveying spans roughly 8,000 square kilometers of boreal forest. Most people can't grasp just how vast and empty this region is. The nearest town is a 4-hour drive on good days, longer when the logging roads turn to mud. Cell service is non-existent out here, and my satellite phone only works reliably in clearings. I maintain radio contact with the regional office twice daily. Morning and evening check-ins are mandatory for safety protocols. My daily routine involves maintaining a network of trail cameras, collecting GPS collar data from tagged moose, and documenting signs of population movement. The Alberta Wildlife Service wants updated numbers on breeding pairs, calf survival rates, and migration patterns. Climate change has been affecting their traditional ranges, and there's concern about the impact of expanding logging operations on their habitat. I work out of a modified Ford F250 with a camper attachment, essentially my mobile office and home. The truck is equipped with heavy-duty suspension to handle the rough terrain, extra fuel tanks, and a reinforced storage system for my equipment. I've got 12 trail cameras to maintain, spread across strategic points in the study area. Each one needs its memory card changed every 2 weeks, batteries checked, and positioning verified. It's methodical work, but necessary for accurate data collection. The landscape here is a mix of black spruce, forest, muskeg bogs, and the occasional rocky outcrop. Logging companies have carved a network of access roads through the wilderness, but many of these are barely maintained. During spring thaw or heavy rains, they can become nearly impassable. I've learned to always carry recovery gear, and to never take a new route without first checking the satellite imagery and topographic maps. My credentials matter out here. I hold a bachelor's degree in wildlife biology from the University of British Columbia and have completed specialized training in wildlife tracking, camera trap deployment, and wilderness first aid. This isn't the kind of work you can fake your way through. The data I collect needs to be reliable enough for peer review, and my field observations have to stand up to scrutiny from the Wildlife Service. The isolation takes some getting used, too. Most people don't understand what it's like to go weeks seeing only your own reflection. The nearest human presence is usually just radio chatter from logging crews, but they operate in different sectors most of the time. I've learned to appreciate the solitude, though. There's something pure about being the only human observer in thousands of square kilometers of wilderness. My typical day starts before dawn. I check weather reports on the satellite system, plan my route, and make sure all my gear is prepped. I carry standard field equipment, GPS unit, camera gear, data logs, and basic survival supplies. There's always a rifle in the truck too. This is bear country, after all. Both black bears and grizzlies are common here, and while encounters are rare, you need to be prepared. The moose themselves are fascinating creatures. An adult bull can weigh up to 700 kilograms, with antlers spanning up to 2 meters. They're surprisingly elusive for their size, and tracking them requires understanding their habits, preferred feeding areas, and seasonal movements. The population here has been stable, but showing signs of stress from habitat changes. That's why this study is so important. We need to understand how they're adapting. I document everything meticulously. Each observation, track, or camera capture gets logged with precise GPS coordinates, timestamps, and environmental conditions. Even seemingly minor details like browse patterns or bedding sites can provide valuable data about population health and behavior. This isn't just about counting animals. It's about understanding their entire ecosystem and how it's changing. The work requires a certain mindset. You have to be comfortable with your own company, trust your training, and maintain professional focus even when you're weeks into a field rotation. There's no room for cutting corners or making assumptions. Every piece of data I collect could influence wildlife management decisions that affect this entire region. I've been on this particular contract for 3 months now, and I've got another 5 to go. 8 months might seem like a long time, too, spend in the wilderness, but that's what it takes to gather meaningful data across all seasons. You need to understand how these animals adapt to everything from summer heat to winter storms, from spring floods to fall migrations. The territory I'm surveying spans roughly 8,000 square kilometers of boreal forest. Most people can't grasp just how vast and empty this region is. The nearest town is a 4-hour drive on good days, longer when the logging roads turn to mud. Cell service is non-existent out here, and my satellite phone only works when I can find a clear patch of sky, which isn't often under the dense canopy. My first week on site followed a comfortable routine. Each morning, I'd load up my Ford Ranger with equipment and head out before sunrise. The truck's worn suspension would protest against the rutted logging roads as I made my way to predetermined GPS coordinates. These points were carefully selected to give us the best possible data on moose movement patterns and population density. Setting up trail cameras is an art in itself. You need to consider game trails, seasonal migration patterns, and natural bottlenecks in the terrain. I'd spend hours securing cameras to trees at just the right height and angle, clearing sight lines and testing trigger distances. Each camera had to be logged with precise coordinates, and I maintained detailed notes about the surrounding habitat. The forest was alive those first days. Red-tailed hawks would circle overhead, their distinctive screams echoing through the trees. Black chickadees flitted between branches, their cheerful calls a constant companion as I worked. In the early mornings and late evenings, the haunting bugles of bull elk would carry 4 kilometers, announcing their presence during the beginning of rutting season. I documented everything I came across: moose tracks in muddy depressions, torn bark where they'd fed on trees, and beds where they'd rested in the underbrush. The signs were abundant and fresh, suggesting a healthy population. I collected scat samples, measured track depths, and photographed browse patterns on vegetation. All of this would help build a comprehensive picture of moose behavior and habitat use in the region between camera sites. I'd often stop to glass clearings with my binoculars. Sometimes I'd spot moose at the edges of cut blocks, the squared-off areas where logging operations had cleared the forest. They'd be browsing on the young vegetation that thrives in these openings. Occasionally, I'd see bears too, usually black bears fattening up on berries before winter. The work was methodical and satisfying. Each evening, I'd return to my small field cabin to transfer data from my handheld GPS to my laptop, charge batteries, and prepare equipment for the next day. The cabin itself was basic but functional. A single room with a cot, a propane stove, and a desk where I could work on reports. Solar panels provided enough power for my essential equipment, and a small generator served as backup. I'd end each day by stepping outside to smoke my pipe and listen to the forest transition from day to night. The evening chorus of birds would gradually give way to the first tentative hoots of great horned owls. On clear nights, the stars would be incredible, undiminished by any artificial light for hundreds of kilometers in any direction. The sounds of the forest became a familiar backdrop to my work. The rustle of aspens in the wind, the tap of woodpeckers, the occasional crash of a moose moving through thick brush. I learned to read these sounds, to understand what they meant about the movement and behavior of wildlife in the area. When you spend enough time in the wilderness, you develop an instinct for its rhythms and patterns. Those first days were productive. I managed to set up 28 trail cameras across my primary study area, each one carefully positioned and tested. The weather held steady, cool autumn days with just enough cloud cover to keep the harsh sun at bay. Everything was going according to plan, and my initial data suggested this would be a successful population study. Looking back now, I realize how normal everything felt then. The forest was behaving exactly as it should, following patterns I had observed countless times before in similar studies. The wildlife was abundant and behaving naturally, and the ecosystem appeared healthy and balanced. There was nothing to suggest what would happen later, nothing to warn me about the changes that were coming. It was during my third week when things started to feel different. The autumn air had grown sharper, carrying that distinctive bite that warns of approaching winter. I was checking camera station 17, about 40 kilometers deep into the northwestern quadrant of my study area, when I first noticed something odd. The morning had started like any other. I'd left my cabin before sunrise, the truck's headlights cutting through a light mist that clung to the logging road. The weather report had promised clear skies, but here in the boreal forest, moisture seems to have a mind of its own. I'd been making good progress, downloading footage from each camera and replacing batteries where needed. Camera 17 was positioned near a natural funnel point where two ridges converged, creating a natural pathway that wildlife frequently used. As I approached the site, something about the ground caught my attention. The soil there was perfect for tracking a mix of clay and organic matter that held impressions well, especially with the recent light rain we'd had. At first I thought I was looking at bear tracks. We get plenty of those up here, and they're not unusual to find near my camera stations. But as I knelt down to examine them more closely, something felt off. The impressions were broader than any bear print I'd documented before, and significantly deeper. The stride length was what really got my attention. These prints were spaced much further apart than a bear's typical gait, and they appeared to follow a bipedal pattern. That can't be right, I remember muttering to myself as I pulled out my field notebook and measuring tape. The prints measured approximately 16 inches in length and 7 inches across at the widest point. The depth varied but averaged around 2 inches in the softer soil. What struck me as particularly unusual was the apparent arch in the middle of each print, something you don't typically see in bear tracks. I've been doing this kind of work for over 12 years, and I've seen plenty of unusual tracks. Sometimes rain or melting snow can distort impressions, making them appear larger or oddly shaped. Other times, multiple tracks can overlap, creating the illusion of a single, larger print. But these were different. They were crisp, well-defined, and appeared to have been made within the last 24 hours. Judging by the moisture content of the soil and the lack of debris in the impressions, following standard protocol, I began documenting everything. I placed my scale marker next to the clearest print and took multiple photographs from different angles. The morning light was perfect for photography, casting just enough shadow to highlight the details in each impression. I made detailed sketches in my field notebook, including measurements and notes about the soil composition and weather conditions. The tracks continued for about 30 meters before disappearing into a dense stand of black spruce. What bothered me was how they seemed to maintain the same bipedal pattern the entire way. Bears will occasionally stand and walk on their hind legs for short distances, but they typically drop back to all fours for actual travel. These tracks showed no sign of switching to a quadrupedal gait. I found myself calculating the weight needed to create impressions of that depth in this soil type, based on my experience and considering the soil composition and moisture content. Whatever made these tracks had to weigh at least 700 pounds, possibly more. That's well beyond the size of any black bear in this region, and we're well outside the normal range for grizzlies. After completing my documentation, I checked the memory card from camera 17. Part of me hoped it might have captured whatever had left those tracks, but the footage showed only the usual parade of moose, deer, and smaller wildlife. If whatever made these prints had passed by, it had done so just outside the camera's field of view. I spent another hour searching the surrounding area for additional signs, broken branches, hair samples, or scat, anything that might help identify what had passed through. But aside from the tracks themselves, I found nothing unusual. The forest felt normal. Chickadees were calling, red squirrels were chattering their complaints at my presence, and a pileated woodpecker was hammering away at a dead spruce nearby. Before leaving, I set up 2 additional cameras around the track site, positioning them to cover different angles. If whatever made these prints was a regular visitor to this area, I wanted to document it. I made a mental note to request some additional equipment from the project coordinator, perhaps some higher sensitivity, motion sensors, or infrared cameras. As I drove back to my cabin that evening, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. The logical part of my brain worked through various explanations. An unusually large bear with an injured front paw forcing it to walk upright. Multiple overlapping tracks creating a misleading pattern, or simply my own misinterpretation of what I'd observed. But none of these explanations fully satisfied what I'd documented. Back at the cabin, I transferred the photos to my laptop and spent several hours examining them in detail. The images were clear and well lit, showing every nuance of the prints. I compared them with my database of known track patterns from various North American wildlife species. Nothing matched. The closest comparison I could make was to some primate prints I'd seen in a colleague's research from Southeast Asia. But that was obviously impossible here in northern Alberta. I considered sending the photos to my supervisor, but decided against it for the moment. Without additional context or evidence, I'd likely just get a lecture about proper track identification and the importance of not jumping to conclusions. Instead, I made detailed entries in my official field log, being careful to stick to objective observations without speculation. That night, as I sat on my cabin's small porch, smoking my evening pipe, I found myself paying more attention to the sounds of the forest. The familiar noises, the wind in the trees, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, suddenly seemed more significant, as if they might be trying to tell me something I'd been missing all along. That evening, back at my research cabin, I was updating my field notes when an unusual smell drifted through the partially open window. At first, I thought a skunk might have sprayed nearby. It had that same kind of immediate, attention-grabbing quality. But this was different. The odor was more complex, musky and acrid, with an almost chemical undertone that made my nose wrinkle. It wasn't the sweet rot smell of carrion, which I was unfortunately quite familiar with from finding winter-killed moose. This was something else. I got up and checked around the cabin's perimeter with my flashlight, but found nothing obvious. The smells seemed to come and go with the light breeze, sometimes intense enough to make my eyes water, then fading to almost nothing. It reminded me vaguely of wet fur, mixed with something I couldn't quite place, perhaps closest to the sharp, ammonia-like smell of big cat urine at a zoo, but more intense that as I lay in my bunk that night, sleep wouldn't come. The smell had mostly dissipated, but now something else kept me alert, a sound carrying through the darkness. At first, I tried to dismiss it as equipment from one of the logging operations in the region, a rhythmic knocking, almost mechanical in its regularity. Knock, 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 each impact separated by roughly 10 seconds. But I knew the nearest active cutting block was over 15 miles away. Even in the still night air, heavy equipment wouldn't carry that far. Besides, no logging crew would be working this late. It was well past 11 o'clock. The knocking continued for nearly 45 minutes. I found myself counting the intervals, noting how consistent they were. Too consistent for a branch hitting a tree in the wind, and anyway, the night was calm. Too loud for a woodpecker, too rhythmic for natural forest sounds. Each knock seemed to come from roughly the same direction and distance, somewhere to the northwest of my cabin. I lay there in the darkness, my scientific mind trying to catalogue and classify what I was hearing, while another, more primitive part of my brain urged me to remain absolutely still and quiet. The next morning, I forced myself to stick to my regular routine despite getting barely 3 hours of sleep. Camera checks couldn't wait. We had strict protocols about data collection timing. The forest felt different in the pale morning light. Almost normal, except for a lingering trace of that strange odor from the night before. I reached my first camera station around 8:30 in the morning. Everything looked undisturbed. The memory card showed only the usual parade of deer and small mammals. The second station was similar. It wasn't until I approached the third camera, the one nearest to where I'd found those unusual tracks yesterday, that I stopped dead in my tracks. Across the game trail, someone or something had arranged broken spruce limbs in a distinct pattern. They formed a rough lattice, like a crude fence, about 3 feet high, blocking the trail completely. These weren't random fallen branches. Each piece had been deliberately snapped, not cut, but broken with considerable force and carefully laid across others to create the structure. I stood there for several minutes, trying to make sense of it. Hunters sometimes marked trails, but this was different. The breaks in the wood were fresh, the sap still sticky, and the needles hadn't begun to brown. This had been constructed recently, probably within the last 12 hours. The precision bothered me. Despite the crude materials, there was an undeniable intelligence behind the arrangement. Each branch had been placed with purpose, creating a barrier that would force any passing animal to either turn back or move around it. As I photographed the structure, the hair on the back of my neck began to prickle. The forest had gone quiet, again, like it had last night. No wind rustled the canopy above, no birds called from the branches. Just that heavy, watching silence. I found myself scanning the tree line more frequently as I worked, unable to shake the sensation of being observed. The feeling was so intense that several times I spun around, certain I'd catch someone standing there. But there was only forest, still and silent, stretching away in every direction. Back at my workstation that evening, I began the tedious process of reviewing the trail camera memory cards. The first few cameras showed nothing unusual, just the typical parade of moose, deer, and the occasional black bear. But when I reached the footage from camera 7, my hands went cold. The timestamp showed 2:15 a.m. from the previous night. During that period of strange knocking, the image quality wasn't great. These weren't exactly high-end surveillance cameras, but what I could make out made my mouth go dry. There, in the grainy infrared shot, was a massive dark figure standing near a recently downed bull moose. I leaned closer to my laptop screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure was partially obscured by branches, but its posture was unmistakably upright. Using the moose carcass for scale, I estimated the figure had to be at least 8 feet tall, possibly taller. Its proportions were all wrong for a bear. Rearing up, the shoulders too broad, the arms too long. I spent the next hour analyzing that single frame, trying to find some rational explanation. Maybe it was a shadow, a trick of the infrared lighting, or to animals that happened to overlap in the frame. But deep down, I knew I was grasping at straws. The next morning, I hiked out to camera 7's location. The autumn air was crisp, and my breath came out in visible puffs as I approached the site. The moose carcass was still there, but something about it seemed wrong. As I got closer, my stomach turned. The bones weren't broken, they were twisted. Not crushed or snapped like you'd see with a bear attack, but actually wrenched and torqued in ways that defied natural predation. Some of the larger bones had been literally corkscrewed, requiring a kind of strength I couldn't even comprehend. The surrounding ground was trampled, but among the chaos, I could make out several of those same massive footprints I'd documented earlier. I took the required photographs for my report, though I had no idea how I would explain what I was seeing. This went beyond anything in my training or experience. As I worked, that familiar feeling of being watched returned. Stronger than ever, back at my desk, doubt began creeping in like a slow tide. I pulled up the photos I'd taken of those first tracks, the ones I'd initially dismissed. With trembling hands, I placed my boot next to my laptop screen, trying to get the scale right. My size 12 boot looked almost childlike in comparison. Using my field measurement software, I began a more detailed analysis. The tracks were consistently 18 inches in length, half again as long as my boot. The depth of the impressions suggested something far heavier than any human. Even accounting for soft soil, the weight distribution indicated something upwards of 700 pounds, moving on 2 legs. "Keep it together," I muttered to myself, running my hands through my hair. "Stay objective, stay scientific." I opened my contract paperwork, reminding myself why I was here. Moose, population dynamics, habitat use patterns, migration routes, simple, straightforward wildlife biology. But my eyes kept drifting back to those track photos, to that blurry trail cam image. I forced myself to type up my daily report, trying to focus on the legitimate data I'd collected. Moose sign, present. Browse patterns, consistent with seasonal expectations. But how could I document what I'd found at that carcass site? What would my supervisors make of those twisted bones, those impossible tracks? I started a separate document, one just for my own records. In it, I logged everything that didn't fit the normal parameters: the tracks, the broken branches, the strange knocking sounds, that horrific smell. I included all measurements, all GPS coordinates, all timestamps. If nothing else, I needed to maintain scientific rigor, even if what I was documenting seemed to defy science itself. My training warred with what my eyes were telling me. I'd spent years learning to identify signs of North American wildlife, to understand their behaviors and patterns. Nothing in my education or experience could explain what I was seeing. Yet here was the evidence. Spread across my desk in photos and samples, I picked up one of the hair samples I'd collected, examining it under my portable microscope. The structure was unlike anything in my reference materials, too thick for bear, too coarse for moose, with a medulla pattern I'd never encountered before. Another piece of evidence that didn't fit any known category. Still, I had a job to do. 3 more weeks on this contract. The rational part of my mind insisted I could complete my work while simply documenting these anomalies as a side project. After all, wasn't that the scientific approach? Observe, record, analyze, without jumping to conclusions. But as night began to fall outside my research station, I couldn't shake the memory of that massive figure in the trail cam photo, or the way those moose bones had been so deliberately twisted. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just some undocumented species. It was intelligent, purposeful, and, based on the evidence mounting on my desk, it was aware of my presence in its territory. The next morning, I noticed the first real change in the forest's rhythm. As I entered the narrow valley where I'd found the twisted moose carcass, the usual morning chorus of birds fell silent. Not gradually, but all at once, like someone had flipped a switch. The sudden absence of sound was so stark it made my ears ring. I'd spent enough time in these woods to know this wasn't normal. Birds don't just collectively decide to stop singing unless there's a predator nearby. But this silence felt different. More complete, more deliberate. Even the wind seemed to die in these moments, leaving me in a vacuum of sound that made every crunch of my boots feel thunderous. That evening, as I sat reviewing my day's notes, I heard it again, that distinctive knocking sound, but this time it was different. The first knock came from somewhere to my west, maybe 200 yards out. Before its echo could fade, another answered from the east, then another from the north. It was as if something was triangulating my position, using the trees as some kind of primitive communication system. I found myself holding my breath, straining to detect any pattern in the knocks. They seemed to follow my movements when I shifted in my chair. A new series would start up, closer this time. The sounds weren't random. They had rhythm and purpose. My scientific mind tried to catalog them, to find some rational explanation. But all I could think about was how coordinated they seemed. Over the next few days, this pattern repeated itself. Certain valleys would fall dead silent as soon as I entered them. These weren't random spots. They were always near where I'd found signs before. The twisted carcass, the strange tracks, the arranged branches. It was as if invisible boundaries had been drawn, and I was crossing them without understanding their significance. My wildlife technician training taught me about territorial behaviors, about how animals mark and defend their ranges. But this felt more sophisticated. The silence would follow me, moving like a bubble of dead air as I walked through these areas. Sometimes I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, just shadows, shifting in ways that didn't match the wind's direction. The knocking continued each night, growing more frequent. I started mapping the sounds, marking their locations on my topographical charts. A pattern emerged. They formed rough circles around my position, always maintaining distance, but never breaking contact. When I moved my camp, the circle would shift with me. My professional detachment was slipping. I found myself rushing through my moose surveys, constantly looking over my shoulder. The forest I'd known so well, the one I'd studied with scientific precision, was becoming alien territory. Every broken branch now carried potential meaning. Every shadow might hide something, watching, waiting, communicating about my presence in ways I couldn't understand. I was no longer just a researcher observing wildlife. I had become something else, an intruder, perhaps, in a territory I hadn't known existed. My data sheets started including notes about the silence, about the knocking, about the way the forest itself seemed to react to my presence. These weren't the objective observations of a wildlife technician anymore. They were the records of someone slowly realizing they might be the one being studied. The night started like any other in camp, but something felt different. I'd finished my evening meal and was organizing data on my laptop when the first heavy footfall made me freeze. It came from behind my tent, a deliberate, weighty step that pressed into the forest duff with purpose. Then another, and another. I killed my laptop light and reached for my rifle, my hands moving on instinct. The steps continued, methodically circling my campsite. Whatever was out there made no attempt to conceal its movement. Each footfall landed with a force that seemed to vibrate through the ground. My breath caught as rocks began tumbling down the slope to my north. Not the random scatter of natural erosion, these sounded purposeful, as if something was nudging them loose one by one. The impacts created a rhythm. Tumble, pause, like someone testing my reaction. I sat absolutely still, rifle across my knees, straining my eyes against the darkness beyond my tent walls. The moon cast enough light to create shifting shadows through the trees, but nothing solid emerged. Just those heavy steps, completing another circuit around my camp, and more rocks clattering down the hillside. The sound of my own heartbeat seemed thunderous in my ears. I'd spent countless nights in the wilderness, dealt with curious bears and prowling cougars, but this was different. The calculated nature of the movement, the deliberate stone rolling, it spoke of intelligence rather than animal instinct. Hours crept by. My back ached from maintaining the same vigilant posture, but I didn't dare move. The circling continued with variations. Sometimes the steps would pause, as if whatever was out there was studying my tent from different angles. Occasionally, a particularly large rock would crash down the slope, making me flinch despite my attempts to stay calm. The first hint of dawn found me still sitting upright, rifle ready, muscles cramped from tension. As the sky lightened, the footsteps gradually retreated into the forest. The last thing I heard was a single heavy rock tumbling down the slope, a final reminder of the night's vigil. When full daylight arrived, I emerged from my tent on shaky legs. The ground around my campsite was marked with impressions, the same massive tracks I'd been finding, but now in a clear circle around where I'd spent the night. Near the slope, several rocks had indeed been displaced. Some rolled several yards from their original positions. I couldn't write this off as coincidence anymore. The systematic nature of the encounter, the careful testing of my reactions, this wasn't random wildlife behavior. Something had deliberately surrounded my camp, had purposefully manipulated my environment, had kept me under observation for hours. My hands trembled as I photographed the tracks and the displaced rocks. The scientific part of my mind tried to catalogue and measure, but another part of me was finally accepting what I'd been trying to deny. I was dealing with something far beyond my normal research parameters, something that combined raw, physical power with calculated intelligence. That morning, as I made my coffee with unsteady hands, I knew I could no longer maintain the comfortable skepticism that had carried me through the earlier signs. Whatever was out here had made its presence undeniable, and I had to face the reality that I was sharing these woods with something I couldn't explain. I knew I had to report what I'd found, the twisted moose carcass and that unsettling trail. Camera image couldn't be ignored, no matter how much I wanted to pretend they were normal occurrences. The next morning, I drove my truck down to the ranger station, the memory card feeling heavy in my pocket. Provincial Ranger Matthews met me in his office, a cramped space filled with topographical maps and filing cabinets. He listened patiently as I described finding the moose remains, his weathered face remaining neutral. When I mentioned the trail camera image, he leaned forward slightly. "Let's have a look then," he said, sliding the card into his computer. The image appeared on his screen, that massive dark figure near the downed bull moose. Even in the daylight of his office, it made my skin crawl. Matthews squinted at the screen. "Could be camera glitch," he said, but I noticed how his eyes kept returning to the figure's proportions, or maybe a bear standing up. They can look mighty strange in these motion-triggered shots. He called in the sheriff's deputy, Officer Wilson, who arrived 20 minutes later. Wilson examined both the photo and my report about the moose carcass with professional detachment. "Bones twisted, you say?" Wilson made notes in his official pad. "Bears are powerful animals. Could have been scavengers too, working the carcass. Over time," but I could see something in their expressions, a flicker of doubt. Maybe recognition when they studied that trail cam image. The deputy kept tilting his head, as if trying to make the figure fit into some familiar category. "Look," I said, "I know what bear damage looks like. This was different. The way the bones were, I struggled to find the right words. It was like something had deliberately twisted them. And those tracks I found, let's stick to what we can verify." Matthews interrupted, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. "No sense getting folks worked up over what's probably got a perfectly natural explanation." Wilson handed me back my memory card. "We'll file a report about the moose remains. Standard procedure. But unless you've got something more concrete." Their dismissal was polite but firm. Yet, as I turned to leave, Matthews called after me. "Hey," he said, then paused as if choosing his words carefully. "Just keep your radio handy out there, all right?" Walking back to my truck, I felt more alone than ever. They'd done exactly what they were supposed to do, offer rational explanations, maintain calm, avoid speculation. But their careful skepticism only highlighted how extraordinary my experiences had been. They hadn't seen the broken branches arranged in patterns, hadn't heard those methodical knocks, hadn't felt the ground shake from something massive circling their tent. I sat in my truck for a long moment, staring at the memory card in my hand. Their dismissal should have reassured me, suggested I was imagining things, seeing patterns where none existed. Instead, it left me with the unsettling certainty that I was on my own with whatever was out there in those woods. The weeks after my meeting with Ranger Tanner and Deputy Phillips dragged on like a slow descent into winter. Each day brought new signs that I wasn't welcome in these woods, signs too deliberate to ignore. I tried maintaining my professional routine, but the changes were impossible to dismiss. It started with the trail cameras. I'd arrive at locations where I'd carefully positioned them to monitor movement, only to find them shifted, turned 30 or 45 degrees away from their intended focus. At first, I blamed wind or perhaps curious bears, but the adjustments were too precise, too consistent. The cameras weren't damaged or knocked down. They were deliberately repositioned, as if something understood their purpose and objected to. Being watched, the access trails told their own story. I'd arrive at familiar paths to find large stones placed across them, not randomly scattered like rockfall, but arranged in clear lines. Some weighed easily 50 pounds or more, yet they appeared overnight, positioned with obvious intent. Moving them became a daily ritual, one that felt increasingly like a silent argument with something that wanted me to turn back. The branches were what truly unnerved me. I'd find them twisted, not broken by wind or snow load, but actually woven. Together, young saplings would be bent into impossible shapes, their tips secured under their own roots. These weren't natural formations. They required strength and deliberate manipulation. I photographed each one, building a record that looked more like evidence than scientific data. One morning, I found an entire spruce sapling uprooted and laid across my usual parking spot. Its roots were cleaned of soil, as if it had been carefully extracted rather than torn out. The placement was too specific to be random. It blocked exactly where I needed to turn my truck around. I spent 45 minutes dragging it aside, all the while feeling watched from the tree line. The pressure was constant but subtle. Nothing overtly threatening occurred. No direct confrontations, no damage to my equipment. Instead, it felt like a steady campaign of suggestion. Leave. Go back. This isn't your place. Each small disruption added to the weight of that unspoken message. My field notes became a catalogue of these incidents. October 15th, 3 cameras redirected. October 18th, stone line across North Access Trail. October 21st, twisted branch structure near creek crossing. The scientific detachment in my writing felt increasingly forced, a thin veneer over growing unease. I kept up my work, checking cameras, logging data, maintaining the appearance of normal research activities, but I found myself moving differently. Through the forest, checking sight lines, listening more intently, making mental notes of escape routes. The wilderness I'd known as a workplace was transforming into something else, territory where I was. At best, barely tolerated. The morning air bit cold and sharp as I made my rounds checking the trail cameras. I'd placed them strategically across my study area, hoping to capture more evidence of moose movement patterns, or perhaps something else. The first two locations were untouched, the cameras still faithfully recording as programmed. But as I approached the third site, my stomach dropped. The heavy-duty mounting strap, rated for severe weather conditions, had been torn clean through. Not cut, not unfastened, torn apart like paper. The camera itself was simply gone. I searched the surrounding area for 20 minutes, but found no trace of the expensive equipment. Trying to maintain my composure, I headed to the fourth location. The scene there made me stop dead in my tracks. The camera lay shattered at the base of a large spruce, its protective housing split open like a broken egg. Components were scattered across the forest floor. The lens, battery compartment, and memory card all destroyed beyond recovery. The mounting strap here showed the same violent removal pattern, not the clean cut of human tools, but ragged edges suggesting brute force. This wasn't the work of vandals or thieves. People looking to steal equipment would have simply unfastened the straps or cut them cleanly. This destruction spoke of raw power and deliberate intent. The force required to tear through those industrial-grade straps would have been immense. I'd seen bears damage trail cameras before, but never with this kind of focused brutality. I knelt to examine the scattered pieces, noting how they'd been almost methodically destroyed. The memory card was crushed, making data recovery impossible. Standing there among the broken equipment, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was a message, a clear escalation from the subtle warnings of previous weeks. My hands shook slightly as I photographed the scene with my phone, documenting the destruction from multiple angles. The morning sun cast long shadows through the trees, and for the first time, those shadows seemed to hold more menace than comfort. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line for movement. The financial loss of the cameras was significant, but it was the implications that truly unsettled me. Whatever had done this possessed not just tremendous strength, but also the intelligence to specifically target my monitoring equipment. It understood what the cameras were for and had decided to eliminate them. I gathered what remained of the broken camera into my pack, unwilling to leave even this evidence behind. The weight of it served as a tangible reminder that something out here was actively working to disrupt my research. Something that could tear through reinforced straps as easily as tissue paper, and was methodical enough to ensure no usable footage remained. I had a job to finish. The contract specified 6 months of moose population monitoring, and I still had 3 weeks left. Despite everything that had happened, I couldn't just abandon my responsibilities. My professional reputation and future contracts depended on completing this work, but each day in the field became an exercise in managing growing anxiety. Modified my routine, varying my check times and routes, hoping to be less predictable. It didn't seem to matter. The feeling of being watched persisted, growing stronger with each visit. I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, dark shapes that disappeared when I turned to look directly at them. Not the quick dart of a deer or bear, but something more deliberate, as if whatever it was wanted me to know it was there without fully revealing itself. The most unnerving part was the silence that preceded these moments. I'd worked in wilderness areas long enough to read the forest's mood through its soundscape. Birds, squirrels, and other small creatures would suddenly go quiet, their chatter cutting off as if someone had flipped a switch. Then that smell would arrive, that same acrid, musky odor I'd noticed weeks ago, now becoming horrifyingly familiar. One afternoon, while checking a remaining camera, I heard it, a sharp wooden knock echoing through the trees, then another from a different direction. Answering the first, I fumbled with my phone, managing to hit record just as a third knock sounded. The pattern was too regular, too intentional to be natural. These weren't the random sounds of falling branches or trees creaking in the wind. I played the recording. Back that evening in my truck, the sound even more unsettling through my headphones. The knocks had a clear rhythm, almost like a code. I thought about sending it to Ranger Tanner, but stopped myself. The recording wouldn't prove anything concrete. He'd probably suggest woodpeckers or some other rational explanation. Besides, after his dismissive response to the trail camera image, I wasn't eager to appear more unstable in his eyes. The shadows seemed to grow bolder. Where before they'd kept to the tree line, now they'd appear closer, just at the edge of clearings where I worked. Sometimes I'd turn around to find fresh prints in soil that had been empty moments before, as if something was deliberately leaving signs of its passage while my back was turned. I started talking out loud during my surveys, not to communicate, but to maintain some sense of normalcy. The sound of my own voice helped combat the oppressive silence that would descend without warning. But even this small comfort was stripped away when my words began drawing those rhythmic knocks in response, as if whatever was out there was mocking my attempts at self-reassurance. Each day became a battle between professional obligation and primal instinct. My training told me to document everything systematically, but something deeper warned me that drawing too much attention to these occurrences might provoke an escalation I wasn't prepared to face. The autumn rains had turned the access roads treacherous. I should have known better than to push my ATV through that stretch of clay-rich soil, but I was trying to finish my rounds before the weather worsened. The wheels spun uselessly, digging deeper into the rust-colored muck as I tried to power through. After 10 minutes of futile effort, I had to accept that I was properly stuck climbing off the vehicle. My boots sank ankle-deep into the wet clay. I'd need to winch myself out using a nearby tree as an anchor point. As I trudged through the mud to retrieve the cable from the front storage compartment, something caught my eye in the churned earth beside the ATV's tracks. At first, I thought it was just another deep rut from my wheels, but the shape was too distinct, too anatomically precise. There, pressed cleanly into the clay, was a footprint that made my blood run cold. It was similar to the tracks I'd photographed weeks earlier, but this one was enormous, easily 20 inches long and proportionally wide. The toes were clearly defined in the soft earth, 5 of them, with dermal ridges visible in the impression. What struck me most wasn't just its size, but its freshness. The edges were crisp, unmarred by rain, meaning whatever left it had passed through recently. Very recently. The thought that something that large had been this close, possibly watching my struggle with the ATV, sent a wave of vulnerability through me. I forced myself to photograph the print, placing my own boot beside it for scale. My size 12 work boot looked childlike in comparison. The depth of the impression suggested massive weight behind it, and the stride length, visible from a partial second print further back, indicated something that moved with an enormous gait. That was it. I'd reached my limit. I quickly winched the ATV free, my eyes constantly scanning the tree line. The rain was picking up again, and I knew the print would soon be lost to the weather. But I couldn't bring myself to care about preserving evidence anymore. This was no longer about documentation or scientific curiosity. This was about survival instinct screaming at me to leave. Back at base camp that evening, I drafted an email to my project supervisor. I cited ongoing equipment interference affecting data collection integrity. Technically true, given the damaged cameras and now the ATV incident. I requested an early termination of the contract, offering to submit my collected data as S. I knew it would look unprofessional, but professional concerns had become secondary to my growing certainty that I was being deliberately pressured out of these woods. The fresh track beside my Stucker TV wasn't just another piece of evidence. It was a message. Whatever was out there had been following me, watching me, and now it was close enough to touch. I wasn't about to wait around to see what the next message might be. Back in my apartment, I spent 3 days compiling my final report. I kept it clinical and detached, focusing on equipment failures, data collection interruptions, and compromised study sites. No mention of footprints or nighttime knocking. No reference to that massive shape caught on the trail camera. Just cold facts about damaged gear and incomplete datasets. The provincial authorities stuck to their bare hypothesis when I submitted the documentation. Grizzlies can do surprising damage, the senior ranger told me over the phone, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty when discussing the missing camera. The twisted remains of the moose also went into their files as probable bear predation, despite not matching typical ursine feeding patterns. But sanitizing the report hasn't sanitized my mind. I wake up some nights in a cold sweat, the sensation of being watched still crawling across my skin. In my dreams, I'm back in those woods, and dark figures move through the trees just at the edge of vision. They're always there, always watching, always deciding how close to let me get before sending another warning. The academic part of me wants to return with better equipment, more cameras, proper audio recording gear. The primal part of me knows better. Those missing cameras and twisted branches weren't random events. They were messages. Each incident was a calculated show of force, escalating as I failed to take the hint. I've started looking at satellite maps of northern Alberta differently. Now, the vast stretches of unbroken forest no longer represent pristine wilderness to be studied. They're territories claimed and defended by something that's learned to stay hidden while watching us. We think we're the observers, setting up our cameras and collecting our data. But we're the ones being observed, evaluated, and sometimes warned away. My official report will gather dust in some government database, stripped of its strangest elements. But this account, this warning, is for anyone heading into those remote places with scientific certainty and high-tech gear. You may think you're gathering evidence, but something else is watching and deciding how close you're allowed to come. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story left even the smallest echo within you, consider subscribing. I'll meet you here again tomorrow with another tale that speaks softly to the soul.